and welcome back to the Neutral Voice. I am Samung Deb Barma. This podcast series is a space for thoughtful conversations on neutrality, judgment, and professional responsibility, grounded in real experience across disciplines, where decisions shape outcomes beyond the room. Today, we're joined by Mr. Merril Hirsh, an ADR professional and litigator whose work spans advocacy, arbitration, mediation, and court appointed neutral roles. Drawing on decades of experience on both sides of the table, we'll be reflecting on why some disputes demand neutral involvement beyond advocacy and how trust in process shapes outcomes when the stakes are truly high. Thank you, Mr. Hirsch, for joining us.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
So, to begin with, in many disputes, attention naturally focuses on the size of the claim, but over time, it becomes clear that what is truly at stake often goes far beyond money. People often talk about high stakes disputes as those involving large amounts of money. From your experience, what actually makes a dispute high stakes?
Well, the amount of money that a dispute involves is certainly a way people use the term high stakes, but honestly, I don't think it's the highest stakes that we have in dispute resolution. First of all, if you take it out of the legal system, people who stop wars are doing things at much higher stakes than anything that occurs in that. In the legal system, people who handle capital, obviously incredibly high stakes. People who handle whether kids will stay with their parents or go into foster care are dealing with incredibly high stakes litigation for the people involved. My dad, who lived through the Depression, used to say any problem that can be solved with money isn't really a problem. And there's some truth to that.
You've spent much of your career working within adversarial systems. In your experience, when does advocacy reach its limits? And also, why do some disputes seem to require a neutral presence?
Well, okay. Part of that is how you define advocacy, right? I think if someone is serving in a lawyer role, if you understand advocacy to be doing everything in their power to protect and pursue their clients' actual interests, that never stops. The lawyer is always responsible to do that. That's an ethical responsibility. The thing is that the term advocacy gets used as, well, pushing every button, turning over every stone or rock or pebble or grain of sand to go find things. And actually, those things are sometimes counterproductive. They're done out of fear. What leads many people to go into law in the first place was years ago an article in the ABA Journal that said that law is the only profession in which pessimism among students is correlated to eventual success. In all other professions, it's optimism. And so the type of person who goes into that role is someone who doesn't want to make a mistake, wants to get it right, wants to force themselves. The difficulty is that these end up being counterproductive, that if you pursue, for example, unnecessary, expensive discovery, you're not actually helping your client, and you are probably fomenting more dispute and more expense in the litigation. You may be annoying the judge rather than persuading the judge. And basic persuasion is a function not so much of beating people over the head with your brilliance, but in listening to them, understanding their needs and figuring out to what extent you can help satisfy them in the context of what you're trying to do. And so literally, if you think of advocacy as, I'm going to give you my 20 arguments why I'm right and you're wrong, that's not as effective as persuasion. So in that role, now the reason a neutral is often advantageous is that it's manifold, but one of them is to help the parties get over the roles that they feel compelled to assume and to allow them to pursue what's really productive in getting to it. Obviously, it's getting to people's interests and not just their positions, and understanding what their needs are in a way that they don't necessarily feel comfortable without having assistance. Make the place safer so that whether you're dealing with people separately or together, they feel comfortable in expressing the type of needs and interests that can get fulfilled in the process. helping people who don't do a very good job speaking to each other, who mostly speak at each other, to speak with each other, which people are astonished at the differences that they start out in all types of circumstances, like the political divide in our country, that they assume there's no possibility of any conversation. And in fact, these conversations are amazingly effective because it's eye-opening to be in a setting where you can listen and find out something you didn't know or expect. And neutrals facilitate that process. They also help make sure that the role is ethical. It's also, I mean, for court-appointed neutrals, which is a lot of what I'm the executive director of the Academy of Court-Appointed Neutrals, what people frequently refer to as master or special master, but we're trying to change that name. That role has other roles besides a neutral in the context of a mediation. It's someone brought in to assist a court in a neutral role to help broaden what the court can do. And so it could be assisting by providing expertise, somebody who comes in and is experienced with electronic discovery or cybersecurity, or can help the parties work through a problem because they understand business valuation or understand the science involved in a patent, or can help find where money went from a trust because they're a forensic accountant who can combine ADR skills with other types of technical skills. It could also be somebody using a different means to get to an end instead of waiting for, instead of having motions and fights and arguments and ruling on it. It could be, okay, let's talk about this discovery you sent or whatever it is. What do you really need? I mean, it seems like you're asking for the sun, the moon, and the stars. What are we driving at? What are we trying to get to? It's a different means of trying to do it that broadens the court's power. Could be a monitoring role. Appoint someone to make sure a decree gets implemented and gets implemented fairly, or make sure that claimants in a large mass action or class action are heard. Courts can't sit down with individuals and make sure they're heard. We all know that's critical to people feeling that they've gotten a just result, and in fact getting a just result isn't just how the ruling comes out, but were they heard as part of the process. There are a lot of roles. Courts can't do that very easily, and the parties can't do it either. They're not going to, very rarely do you have situations where somebody, there's a whole theory of apologies, and occasionally it happens, but that's way more difficult than having someone who listens. So all of which, led me to talk for minutes on end. So you can kick him the greatest song.
Appreciate the things that you have shared. I think it sheds a greater light to what I was looking for through the question. Then also, how do disputes behave differently when the outcome affects financial exposure on the one hand and identity, relationships, or future access on the other?
I think that's a big factor. Look, it makes a huge difference if you've got a case in which this is essentially a one-off. People have a dispute, they're in court, they never expect to see each other again. So the issue between them is what they're disputing in court, and really not much else. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't other things involved. There could be identity, person needs, people can be offended by how they were treated, and that matters to them in working through a settlement. But, if the issue is really, I think you owe me X and you don't, right? That in some ways makes it quote unquote easier because it's a simpler question. In some ways makes it harder because it sounds like it's a zero-sum game. It's rarely entirely zero-sum, but sometimes is. When you get to discussions that are quite different, that what the parties are trying to do, my experience is mainly in complex litigation. One of the things I do is I do family law mediations for DC Superior Court, in part because I thought it was broadening. I could learn more from doing it. And one of the things you realize is, first of all, that obviously they're different. You have people discussing child custody and visitation and this kind of stuff. Motion involved is very different, and often it is, and people yell at each other. But a few things that happen. One is you can start off a mediation by saying, tell me about your dog. And as an icebreaker, I mean, I've never had that opportunity in commercial case, right? I mean, I do things I try to do, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But as an icebreaker, you very rarely say, "Oh, I hate the daughter." No, I mean, they instantly, coalesce on talking about their child, and you can see the joy in their eyes, and that sets a particular type of tone. A second enormous difference in that setting is if the daughter is 3 years old and they're in on some dispute with the court. The thing is, the issue isn't actually how do they resolve their current dispute so they can get out of court. That's the least of it. It's how are they going to raise this child for the next 15 years? So you're talking about how they will continue to communicate. Do they need help? Do they need conflict assistance, coaching? Do they need different types of, can they use a parenting app? Can they do this? You're actually trying to set in place their ability to resolve their own dispute going forward without a court and without a mediator. That's super different, right? Now, as you get in the middle where you have commercial disputes among repeat players, you see completely different situations from one-offs. One of the leading edge areas for sure of dispute, alternative dispute resolution is construction. And in construction, people have disputes constantly, nonstop. Everyone expects there are going to be problems. Things aren't going to be up to spec. They aren't going to agree. They aren't going to read the plans the same way. They're going to have defects. Things happen in construction. But the thing is, you still have to finish the project and you still have to work with this subcontractor or contractor in the next project. So spending your time duking it out on who can get the best result at the end of a trial is a hugely counterproductive process. And in the world of construction, people recognize that. It became leading edge to figure out creative ways to resolve disputes so things can get done. And those things make an enormous difference as a practical matter. And the last thing I'd add is, look, even if it's sort of a money dispute, it isn't entirely. You've got an employment dispute, somebody, they want to fire, the person wants severance pay or whatever, right? Sounds like a money dispute. One of the things I like to do in a setting like that is start off the mediation. It's somewhat up to the parties whether I can do this, but one of the things I suggest is start off the mediation in the same room, but no, don't make speeches to each other about why you're right and they're wrong. That's counterproductive. I'm not interested in that. I just want to talk to both of you. And then the sort of conversation is, okay, you started this business, as I understand, 15 years ago. Tell me about your business. What's your business plan? What are you trying to achieve? Why? And to the employee, how'd you get into this field? And how'd you become whatever, software engineer or whatever? What interested you about coming to the company? It's not that literally it's going to turn on those facts, but it humanizes them because likely the employee can appreciate what the business owners are trying to do in the business, and they can appreciate the employee's interest in the field. And B, it tells you things that later on can matter. Okay, so you've told me that you're trying to compete here. How does fighting this dispute in this way help or hurt you? Would it be better if the dispute were over? You're concerned that the employee will badmouth you in social media. How might you get to a resolution that wouldn't do that?
Thank you. So, again, now talking about situations where the parties do not come in as equals, whether because of resources, authority, or vulnerability, what role can neutrality realistically play?
That's a great question, and I don't think everyone agrees on it. And I think it's hard to chart, and it again depends a lot on circumstance. One view of it is there's no such thing as neutrality. All you can do is attempt it, and to some extent, that's clearly true. You can't completely put aside how you feel about something as much as you try. So that part is true. Obviously, you can't try to help someone, and take on their role. Where I tend to come out in practice is all the participants have a right to be informed, okay? And they have a right, although it's even more complicated. Tone policing is a complex story in its all. But to some extent, they have a right to feel safe in the context of this. If I think one party is being might be abusive, or that the person is taking it as being abusive. It doesn't really matter per se. I don't judge the abuse, quote unquote. I don't say, oh, you're abusive, so you do X. I say, okay, this isn't working objectively. So I'm going to separate you. I'm going to try to talk with you separately where you have, where you're insulated and feel safer, right? And I'm going to try to ask you how this is and listen to what you say about it. Um, I don't think I have, I'm omniscient and I can tell when a person is capable of making their own decisions. So I don't go in there assuming someone's not, right? I mean, in DC, where I do family mediations, DC was one of the first jurisdictions to do mediations in cases involving intimate partner violence. And a lot of people thought that was not possible. Um, and before this started, and DC's arguments for it, I think, are really compelling. I mean, they said, well, first of all, so if someone's the victim of intimate partner violence, they don't get to the benefits of mediation. We're going to add that to whatever else happened, right? Everyone else can get whatever benefit they get mediation. You can't. Secondly, we're assuming this person can't, will be coerced and can't make their decisions. Who are we to decide whether that's true, right? Thirdly, is it possible that the conversation itself may be empowering, that putting them in a safe place and listening to what they say, without judgment is actually a positive thing for them, that it helps them express what their interests are and makes it more likely that they may see that interest satisfied in a discussion. And if that's the case, who are we to say, no, absolutely no one can do it? I mean, if some cases they can't talk, they're in tears or whatever, and therefore we need to be careful that we're not re-traumatizing them by pushing on. But making a rule across the board is really unfair and loses the benefit of the process. I think that's really very thoughtful.
Thank you. So, people often focus on outcomes, but you've also worked deeply on process design and case management. From your perspective, why does trust in the process sometimes matter as much as or more than the legal result itself?
Well, I mean, the answer maybe 30 years ago would be that social science research says it does. I mean, that people report that they care as much or more about a fair process as they do about a favorable outcome. More recently, neuroscience very strongly suggests that the part of the brain that's activated by perceptions of fairness is the same part that's activated by winning. Justice generally and the rule of law, which is a step back. I mean, court-appointed neutral isn't an end in itself. It's trying to pursue the administration of justice so it works for people. Part of working for people is to have a process in which they can feel heard, because that's what people's perceptions of justice are. And to some extent, their perception of justice is whether they have been dealt with justly. Getting the right decision where you don't understand it and you don't think anyone listened to you, as opposed to getting the right decision where they did listen to you and they reflected back what you said and explained why it is that they're reaching the conclusion they're doing, has a hugely different effect on people's perception about whether we have a justice system at all, whether courts work. People come to courts on the worst days of their lives. And to have someone who listens to them carefully and shows that they've listened to them is a huge part of feeling, gosh, someone cared, And so it is every bit, if not more important. Obviously you want to reach the right result, but you haven't really provided the service to somebody in any setting unless you also let them feel heard. And it's a huge practical problem for courts. Judges can't meet individually with the plaintiffs to hear out their problems. That's unethical. And judges, as a resource matter, you can't sit down and do that. You can do it to some extent. And the most creative courts in our country require judges to get training in mediation skills, not because they're going to mediate, but because if you can reflect and reframe what people said, you are helping them get a just process.
Thank you. Following on that, I'd also like to ask what do you think is most at risk when disputes are handled without a trusted neutral presence?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, it depends on what you mean by trusted neutral. I mean, literally, a judge should be a trusted neutral. Okay. So if you're talking about what happens when people resolve disputes on their own without anyone else involved, that's when they duke it out, right? I mean, you know, not everybody is a great eloquent negotiator. I mean, and people get frustrated because they tend to push each other's buttons, and they can end up being violent. They can end up being, and they are very unlikely to think that the process provided them a just result. So it's the ability to go to someone who is neutral in some sense. It doesn't, there are a million different models. I mean, look at tribal courts, as a model. Look at going to elders in a community. It doesn't have to be a particular system, but the idea that there's something out there that's legitimate, that while we disagree over this issue, we agree that this process is a way to resolve the issue, is part of having a common community. It's part of having a sense that you belong within a community, is the ability to resolve disputes. It's essential. You can't function unless you have some ability to resolve disputes that's mutually accepted. And if I'm arguing with you, I don't necessarily accept you as the arbiter of our dispute, so there isn't a mutually accepted force.
So before we wrap up, drawing on from your experience, having worked both as an advocate and as a neutral, what do lawyers tend to misunderstand about neutrality? And to add on to that, what do neutrals sometimes forget about advocacy?
I think lawyers, at least during most of my career, but I still think it's true, okay? I think lawyers, as mediation started to take some kind of hold, when I started, mediation was quite rare. Okay. I mean, when I started, it was after the Pound Conference and Frank Sander and whatever. But when I went to law school, Frank Sander was a teacher there, and I had no clue he had done anything in alternative dispute resolution. And the story was that he was told this wasn't law. Okay. And this is this little sidelight. Right. But I think what happened is lawyers learned mediation as, well, this is some way to get the other side to bend. I'm going to get someone who's strong and tough, who's going to come in, see that we're right about the case, beat up on the other side until they see the light, and then capitulate. That's kind of the model that lawyers, this is what this process ought to be. And therefore, I should do a bang up opening speech that cowls them in the corner. And I don't think, I had a mediation once where the lawyer I represent an insurance company. There were defendants. There's a plaintiff's lawyer. The plaintiff's lawyer began by pointing his finger at one of the defendants and saying, you committed fraud, right? Very few people actually think, maybe Bernie Madoff, I don't know, but very few people actually think they committed fraud. People are the heroes of their own narratives, right? You're never going to convince someone by yelling at them that they committed fraud, right? That's just not persuasive, and they weren't thinking of this as this benefits by being a dialogue, and you've just cut off any chance of getting any dialogue from this guy because you completely destroyed your credibility, right? They don't think of it as a different process. They think of it as lawyering moved to a different room, and they don't understand how the process differs. The flip side is you frequently hear among mediators that in the little speech they'll do at the beginning or whatever, is that it's always better to settle than it is to get, to take a case to trial or take a case to judgment. Honestly, that really rubs me the wrong way, because my reaction is, okay, so you're saying that the right to petition is worthless, that we shouldn't really have a legal system because it's much better to settle than ever having it, that no one has a right to get a decision under law that follows the rules and it tells them what the rule is, that there's no case in which no party is entitled really to want that, And during my career, I had all kinds of cases where this is not going to settle because the parties just need an answer. And this is how they get an answer. And this gives them clarity. It tells them what they can do going forward. And this is a right that's very important. And when you superimpose your desire or perception that it's always better to settle, you're making it a not self-determined process, and you're being arrogant. There are a million different ways to resolve something, and getting a trial, getting a ruling on summary judgment or whatever is absolutely one of them. And so people give lip service to the idea that it's really the party's decision to settle. In back of this is some kind of little arrogant strain of, well, of course I know better than you do about, that really, to me, contradicts the principles behind mediation, but is also wrong in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of my perception.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hirsh, for sharing your thoughtful perspectives, drawing illustrations from your decades of experience. We appreciate your time, and also to all our listeners, thank you for joining us. This has been The Neutral Voice.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.